Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. Now, shortly, Dr. James McGrath is going to join me to talk about his new biography of John the Baptist. It's a very good book, and it sheds light on neglected aspects of the beginnings of our Christian faith. Now, this podcast, the Stone Chapel Podcast, is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. This network is dedicated to providing resources for church leaders to help them face all the complexities of ministry these days. Now, the Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by doing a variety of things, like challenging some assumptions they might have, providing some insights, education, offering some practical steps that are going to help them navigate a variety of cultural contexts. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Ed, tell us about an important research project that we are part of.
You know, it's a changing world, and one of the things that help us understand the changing world is research. And so as churches have been struggling and families may be disconnected and sometimes drifting away from the church, we're kind of dealing with some of the questions of where do we go from here? And the Communio nationwide survey on faith and relationships really kind of points to the family decline and how it relates to faith decline in the United States. Actually, the survey has 3 key issues that are impacting our society today. Go to communio.org/study to download the nationwide study on faith and relationships.
Thanks, Ed. James McGrath has not been with us before. It's his first visit. He's written a new book, provocatively entitled Christmaker. The subtitle, A Life of John the Baptist. Now, Johnny B, as he's sometimes called, or John the Immerser, or John the Dipper, or John the Baptist, is one of the most important figures in early Christianity. He is often neglected. He's overlooked. He's overshadowed by Jesus, perhaps rightly so. But James McGrath thinks that their lives, their ministries, are more intertwined than we thought, and it makes it impossible to fully separate. So he makes that case in his book. So we're going to hear from him today, James McGrath, on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
I'm James McGrath, and I am the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair of New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University in Indianapolis, in Indiana, in the United States. And I have the privilege of teaching texts and topics that I just love. I got into biblical studies as a way of exploring my own faith, trying to learn more. Had a profound, life-changing religious experience in my teens, and was trying to figure out what exactly that meant for my life, and also what does that mean for what I'm going to do with my life. It started out that way as a journey of exploration, but has led to me having the privilege of writing things, teaching, giving talks, and doing things that give me a chance to both facilitate for others, having the chance to do a similar kind of exploration, but also provide resources for that. If someone takes a look at my bookshelves, they will not only see books on a wide array of topics. I am mostly a New Testament professor, but I also do things on side interests like the intersection of the Bible and music, religion and science fiction. And so I'm one of those people that has a wide array of interests.
Dr. James McGrath. James, good to see you. This is the first time on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Yeah, I've been listening and, at the very least, reading the notes that go along with a follower for a very long time.
Hey, listen, thanks. That's good to know. I do appreciate it. The transcripts are often very helpful for those of us who need a quiet moment and don't have a chance to listen, but have a chance to read. So you mentioned music earlier. Tell us a little bit about that side of you, the musical side.
Before this experience that shifted my direction, I was thinking maybe I would go and study music. Got to it late in life and was thinking about that as a possibility. And it was actually an invitation to a concert that led to my connection with that church, that led me to personal faith commitment and the born again experience and things like that resulted. And music has continued to be important to me, both in terms of enriching my life. Sometimes, when I'm thinking about God as transcendent and beyond anything that we can describe, music as, connecting in that way that gets sort of beyond words, and you feel like it's moving me, it's touching me, and words would not do justice to this. It's almost like a sacrament for me, right?
Yeah,
Music.
yeah.
Yeah.
And music does that. I mean, it's got this sort of sense. It touches a part of the brain, touches a part of
Yeah.
us that other things can't touch. Hey, today we're going to be talking about your book. It's a great book. It's called Christmaker, The Life of John the Baptist. And it's just come out, and I love the cover, and you've done a wonderful job. When did it dawn on you that you should be the guy who writes kind of a new biography of John the Baptist?
So this has been on my radar as something, not necessarily sure that it was going to be a biography at that stage, but knew that I was going to need to write about John the Baptist and dig into his life and what we know about him. One of the many things that has distracted me from being focused just on New Testament in and of itself along the course of my career is doing some work on a group known as the Mandaeans, who are essentially an ancient group that consider themselves followers of John the Baptist.
Where do they live, James, today? So are they scattered all over? They're concentrated in a particular place?
Historically, it was Iran and Iraq, but nowadays in particular, there are huge diaspora communities in places like San Antonio, Texas, San Diego, California, Sydney, Australia, Boston area. There's a sizable group in Sweden as well.
So why are they called the Mandaeans?
If we think about the Qumran group, or even probably Christians originally, a label gets affixed that wasn't the one that they sort of chose for themselves first. A term that was used for lay people as opposed to the priests and those who are the people who are sort of really initiated into the esoteric knowledge. Mandaean basically means Gnostic, right? And that really is sort of the character of their religion. Been debate among academics about whether Gnostic is an appropriate term, but there's at least one group, and it's the only ancient Gnostic group to survive down to the present day, and they are actually happy with the term because that's what they understand their name to mean.
Huh. So you call them a Gnostic group, and you said that they really have a fidelity to John the Baptist. Now, how does Jesus figure in that?
The thing that makes them really rather unique in terms of religions is that they are really crazy about John the Baptist and consider themselves to be followers of his. Whether they're faithful adherents, and that whole question is one that you can research historically. You can get into interreligious polemic about that, obviously, but that's how they view themselves, and they view Jesus and Christians as having essentially departed from and distorted John's legacy. And so that makes their sources potentially interesting, right? Not necessarily more authentic or closer to John per se, but they quite possibly, and I argue the case particularly in the forthcoming book that's coming out in October, John of History of Faith, that they have preserved some traditions and memory of John and things related to John along a different route. Probably there were followers of John the Baptist who didn't become Christians that fed somehow into this movement. And the point is not that that's a more authentic perspective on John, as though not believing Jesus makes you closer to John or something like that. But the thing is that when we have more than one angle on something, when we're trying to get a history, it can help us. Looking at sort of Jewish perspectives on Jesus that were not aligned with him can help enrich and inform our portrait, whether it's Josephus or the later still things like the Talmud and stuff like that. And so I think they need to be brought into the picture more than they have been in recent years.
Well, you entitled the book, and I've not heard this term before, Christmaker. I don't know, I may have been sleeping under a rock for a number of years, but it's not an honorific I have heard. So tell us where that came from.
Book titles are tricky things, as you and I both know.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
Trying to come up with something that, it's already the name of an album by this obscure band, and what people are looking for, they're going to find that instead of your book. And so I'll be quite honest that I was brainstorming and trying to think of what to call this book, and had this as one of the ideas that floated in my mind. And talking with publisher, talking with other people were like, that's good. And I actually had some serious misgivings for two reasons. I thought that this title that is catchy and distinctive might alienate Christian readers and Mandaean readers. Don't blame John for Jesus; it's his fault. And Christians are going to be like, Christmaker.
Yeah. Did he make him Christ? He didn't.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing that made me persuaded in the end, other than the catchiness, which was a factor, part of it is that I think John actually influenced a number of what we might call messianic movements and figures in this time period. In particular, Jesus, but not only him. And in that sense, I think that whatever your view about John's direct or indirect role in influencing these figures and setting the stage for them, he did that, right? That's historically looking back the role he played. And so in that sense, I think the term works. Hopefully helps as well.
Yeah, and I've used the term for years, and it's not original to me, forerunner. He's the forerunner of Jesus, right? He's the one who, in a sense, announces him and such. One of the things I like that you say early in the book, and these are not exactly your words, but it's something like that, is that John the Baptist could have been famous in his own right, but he's ultimately overshadowed, at least in the Christian tradition, the West, by Jesus. But there's enough stuff there that could have made him famous in his own, and he is. I mean, among the Mandaeans, among other people as well, particularly to the east, it seems like John's influence very much extended.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, I avoided the term forerunner partly because it's what everybody thinks of.
Yeah,
and
they use this. Yeah, okay, everybody says that.
But also because of the possible ways that we might think of John and his talk about one who is to come after him, a number of them at least potentially configure things in a way that, forerunner might be true, but it's not the whole picture, right? It doesn't do justice to it. Whether it's, John styling himself as Elijah, and so Elisha comes along after him, and so maybe that's one of the ideas in mind when thinking about one who is to come who will be stronger. Elisha, really enacts this regime change and does all this stuff that Elijah didn't do, gets the school of the prophets really up and running. Whether we think about, the idea that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, did John perhaps think of himself as sort of a quasi-priestly Messiah, and that the one who came after him would be the Davidic or royal Messiah, was another possibility. And I found that in the end, John in our sources doesn't use that term either for himself or for the one coming after him. So I couldn't pin it down precisely, but it seems as though between what John says and what Jesus says about John, like he's the opening act, and then once you get to Jesus, then you can ignore him. We're already doing that.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't want to encourage that any further.
Right. Well, there's that line, I think it's in John chapter 3, where John says, he must increase and I must decrease. It's like, I've been in the spotlight now, it's got to be Jesus. And that seems to be the sort of the New Testament or the Christian perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that tells us, I think for Christian perspective, it would be easy to say, John doesn't need to decrease. There's no way that anybody's greater than Jesus, right? But in actual fact, if we look at the perception, the impact, the sense we get from the book of Acts that, the baptism of John was known in places, before baptism in the name of Jesus gets there, that in fact, the only way that Jesus could be greater is if John decreases. And having John express that himself, I think, is saying John is the one who was in the limelight. John was the one that seemed to be more famous in his time. And now is the time to shift things and to put your attention somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was certainly taken seriously by the governing authorities, wasn't he? Yeah. He gets the attention. He's not just some oddball living on the street that does weird and strange things according to social convention of the time. He is a formidable figure against the powers that be at that time. And of course, Jesus succumbs to the powers that be. Jesus himself is crucified by those political powers. There ends up being in the Christian story a greater victory yet at hand, but still, just on a sheer political plane, John had some gravity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that Herod Antipas, when he starts, getting Jesus himself on his radar, he's thinking, oh, John is back.
That's a nightmare he didn't want to relive, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, it's a fascinating book, and I'm really grateful that you've written it and that you've given us an opportunity to talk a little bit about it. I want folks to know about it. It's called Christmaker, the life of John the Baptist, did anything surprise you? You know, as I start writing a book, I always sort of have a sense of where it's going. And then usually somewhere in there, I find things, oh, I didn't know that was there, or this is new. Did anything surprise you as you worked on this?
Oh yes, absolutely. And certainly as part of the broader picture, there are lots of specific things that I could point to. I think certainly one of them clicked for me that John was the son of a priest.
Hmm.
As far as we know, he doesn't go into his father's line of work, but of course, priests did not always serve in the temple, and so the fact that it wasn't mentioned, that wouldn't tell us anything. But he seems to actually be doing something that's potentially opposed to what his father is doing. He's saying, purchase an animal, go to my dad and get a sacrifice, or come meet me at the river, right? And we'll do something else. And so I realize that John potentially is, a bit of a rebel, but not the rebel who the father is a very tie and suit wearing, fundamentalist preacher, and the son grows his hair out and starts a, heavy metal band or something like that.
Yeah.
This is somebody who is doing something profoundly religious and yet potentially in tension with, or at least, an alternative to what his father's doing. And I was like, wow, there's got to be a really interesting family backstory to that.
Yeah. I wonder what family dinners were like, with that.
Right. And so then realizing that actually paying attention to some of the details, that there might actually be some evidence that provides clues to what led John along that unconventional path and that potentially rebellious path. And don't necessarily need to go into detail about it, but there were times when I thought, if only we could figure this out, it would enrich our portrait. And I found that by actually digging into the sources, sometimes, not always, but sometimes there was more there to be found. It just took making John the focus, allowing him to be the center of attention for a little while. Even if that was against his will, right? He's like, no, pay attention. That's what we hear him saying. And yet I think that ultimately, there's more that we can say about John than we have, based on our sources. And I think that when we do that, if our interest ultimately is in Jesus, that our portrait of Jesus is enriched by paying John attention before we rush on.
I like that. I like the way you said that early in the book. If we don't pay attention to John, we're going to usually end up misunderstanding Jesus. And I think that's exactly right. Dr. James McGrath, author of the book Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist. It's published by Eerdmans. Congratulations on the book. And James, we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Hey, stand by for a nugget of wisdom from Dr. James McGrath. The book we've been talking about, Christmaker by James McGrath, is intended for a general audience. Now, there's a more technical version coming. It's going to be released in the fall of 2024. So be sure to look for that, and you can find that at the Lanier Theological Library. Thanks to Kathy Capes, Jessica Mauser, and the amazing Phil Kagi for their help in putting this podcast together. The Stone Chapel Podcast is produced by the good people at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center in Houston, Texas. If you agree, take a minute and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. And please share this podcast with a friend who might be interested. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.
Oftentimes our institutions of higher education are deeply partisan and are splintered along ideological and religious lines. And we often hold very tightly to our views and our beliefs. And I'm so glad that in the process of studying, I realized that somebody who's challenging my beliefs, my viewpoints, isn't necessarily attacking me as a person. In fact, them challenging me could potentially be, and if I approach it right, will be something that's helpful to me, either by thinking about the question, why do I believe what I believe? Right? Why don't I accept what this person says? My own views will be strengthened, right, and enriched. Or I might actually change my mind about something that I'm wrong about, because like all human beings, I've been wrong before. And so realizing that we can actually engage with others, including those who disagree with us, in a way that's enriching, rewarding, positive, is probably the most important lesson I learned as a student, and that I've tried to make part of how I approach being a scholar as well.
If you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.